The morning rain tapped against the windows of Murphy's diner like gentle fingers, creating a rhythm that Frida Martinez had grown to love over the past 3 years. At 48, she moved through the small restaurant with the efficient grace of someone who had found peace in routine, though peace was perhaps too strong a word for what she'd actually found. Acceptance was closer to the truth. Acceptance of a life deliberately smaller than the one she'd once lived. Her dark hair, streaked with early silver that had appeared overnight during her final military deployment, was always pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her green eyes, once sharp enough to spot enemy movement at impossible distances, now held a carefully cultivated calmness that made customers feel instantly at ease. What they couldn't see was how those same eyes automatically cataloged every person who entered, every potential exit, every object that could be used as a weapon if necessary.
"Coffee, Mrs. Henderson?" Frida asked, approaching the elderly woman's usual table by the window. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Mrs. Henderson always arrived at 7:15, always sat at the same table, always ordered the same breakfast. "You're an angel, dear," Mrs. Henderson replied with a warm smile that reminded Frida of her own grandmother, lost to cancer 15 years ago, while Frida was deployed somewhere she couldn't discuss. "And make it strong today. This weather has my joints aching something fierce, and I've got to help my daughter move some furniture later." Frida poured the steaming coffee, her movements precise and controlled. Everything about her spoke of quiet competence. The way she balanced multiple plates without effort, how she remembered not just every customer's order, but their personal preferences and family situations. The gentle authority in her voice when managing difficult situations. What the people of Cedar Falls didn't know was that these skills came from a very different kind of training, earned in places where mistakes meant death for herself and others. Cedar Falls, Montana, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Population 2,847,000, nestled in a valley between rolling hills and dense forests that turned gold in autumn and white in winter. The town survived on logging, a small college that attracted urban kids seeking authentic rural education, and tourism from people seeking what their brochures called authentic small-town America. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear if they wanted to badly enough. Frida had wanted to disappear with a desperation that sometimes still woke her in cold sweats at 3 a.m. 3 years ago, she had arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a duffel bag that had traveled to more countries than most people ever visited, a modest savings account earned through combat pay and hazard bonuses, and a desperate need for anonymity that bordered on obsession. She'd seen Murphy's help wanted ad on a community board at the truck stop outside town, answered it within an hour, and found herself hired by Tom Murphy before the sun set that same day. The transition from Staff Sergeant Frida Martinez, United States Navy SEALs, to Frida Martinez, small-town waitress, had been more jarring than any combat deployment she'd ever experienced. In the military, every moment was scheduled, every action had purpose, every decision carried weight that rippled through command structures and operational outcomes. In Cedar Falls, her biggest decisions involved whether Mrs. Peterson wanted regular or decaf coffee, and whether the lunch special should be meatloaf or pot roast. But gradually she'd found something unexpected in the simplicity, a kind of peace she'd never experienced, even as a child. Her small apartment above Henderson's hardware store was sparse but comfortable, decorated with furniture from the secondhand shop and books from the library's annual sale. Her days followed a predictable pattern that she'd initially found stifling but now cherished. Work at the diner from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m., grocery shopping at Morrison's Market, evening walks along the Cedar Creek path that wound through town, and early bedtime with whatever paperback novel she'd picked up. The locals had accepted her as one of their own with the easy generosity of small-town folk who'd seen enough newcomers over the years to recognize the difference between tourists and people looking for home. They knew she'd come from somewhere else. Her slight accent suggested the Southwest, maybe Arizona or New Mexico, but they respected her privacy in the way that people did when they sensed someone was healing from wounds they couldn't see. Frida was reliable, hardworking, and kind. She never called in sick, never complained about difficult customers, never gossiped about the personal dramas that occasionally erupted in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. That was enough for Cedar Falls, a place that valued character over curiosity. What they didn't see were the scars hidden beneath her long-sleeved shirts, the puckered white line where shrapnel had opened her shoulder during a firefight in Afghanistan, the surgical scars from the bullet wound that had nearly ended her career in Syria, the network of small marks that told the story of 15 years spent in harm's way. They didn't notice how she automatically scanned every room she entered, identifying exits and potential threats with the unconscious efficiency of someone for whom situational awareness was a matter of survival. They missed the way she tensed whenever a motorcycle backfired, how she positioned herself with her back to walls, the slight tremor in her hands when thunder rolled across the valley.
These were the invisible marks of Staff Sergeant Frida Martinez, a woman who had spent 15 years in some of the world's most dangerous places, doing things that would never appear in any official records and protecting people who would never know her name. The transition to civilian life had been rougher than any battlefield she'd ever navigated. The diner's bell chimed as Jake Morrison pushed through the door, shaking rain from his sheriff's jacket and stomping his boots on the worn welcome mat that Mrs. Henderson had crocheted for the diner last Christmas. At 60, Jake was Cedar Falls Rock, a man who'd seen everything the small town could throw at him over 3 decades of law enforcement and handled it all with steady competence and dry humor. "Morning, Frida," Jake said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. His movements were careful, favoring his left knee that had been shattered in a vehicle pursuit 15 years earlier. "The usual, if you please." "Coming right up, Sheriff," Frida replied, already reaching for the coffee pot with her right hand, while her left grabbed his preferred mug, heavy ceramic that could survive being dropped, unlike the delicate china that some establishments favored. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, bacon crisp, but not burnt. As she worked at the grill, Jake studied her with the observant eyes of a career lawman who'd learned to read people the way others read newspapers. In his 3 years of knowing Frida, he'd developed a theory about her that he kept to himself, sharing it only with his wife during their late-night conversations over decaf coffee. The way Frida moved, economical, purposeful, always balanced, reminded him of the military instructors he'd encountered during his own brief service in the National Guard. Her awareness of her surroundings went beyond the professional alertness of an experienced waitress. The controlled strength in her handshake, the way she instinctively positioned herself to watch the door, the fact that she never seemed surprised or startled by anything. Jake had served 2 tours in Vietnam and recognized a fellow warrior when he saw one. "Weather service is calling for heavy rain through the weekend," Jake said, accepting his coffee and inhaling the rich aroma that was one of the small pleasures that made his job bearable. "Creek's already running higher than I've seen it in years. Might want to keep an eye on that situation." Frida nodded, her expression shifting to the focused attention she gave to anything that might affect the safety of her adopted community. Cedar Creek ran right through the heart of town, usually a peaceful stream that added charm to the downtown area and provided a scenic backdrop for the walking path where she took her evening exercise. But she'd noticed the water level rising over the past few days, and something about the situation triggered the same unease that had once warned her about impending ambushes. "You think there's genuine cause for concern?" she asked, setting his breakfast in front of him with the precise placement of someone who understood that details mattered. Jake cut into his eggs with methodical precision, considering his words carefully. He'd learned over the years that panic was contagious in small communities, and false alarms could undermine credibility when real emergencies arose. "Probably not anything immediate," he said finally. This town's been here for 150 years, and the creek's never been a real problem. Old-timers tell stories about high water in the spring, but nothing that ever caused serious damage. But all this rain, combined with the snowpack melting in the mountains. He trailed off, taking a sip of coffee. Well, there's always a first time for everything, and I'd rather worry about nothing than ignore something. As the morning progressed, Frida served the usual crowd with the smooth efficiency that had made her indispensable to Murphy's diner. Construction workers grabbed quick breakfasts before heading to the new subdivision being built on the town's eastern edge, their conversation revolving around weather delays and material delivery schedules. College students nursed hangovers with coffee and aspirin, their young faces reminding Frida of some of the recruits she'd trained during her final years in the service. Retirees came in for the company as much as the food, gathering around the large corner table that had become their unofficial social club headquarters. She knew them all by now, their stories and routines woven into the fabric of her new life like threads in a tapestry. Bill Richardson, the logger who'd lived in Cedar Falls his entire 50-year life and could predict weather better than the meteorologists. Sarah Kim, the town's only physician who'd chosen small-town medicine over a more lucrative city practice because she believed healthcare should be about people, not profits. Tom Murphy himself, the diner's owner who'd inherited the business from his father and took quiet pride in maintaining the community gathering place his family had operated for 2 generations. Dr. Sarah Kim hurried in around 10 o'clock, her usually perfect hair showing signs of a rushed morning, and her professional composure slightly frayed around the edges. She was in her 30s, competent and caring. Someone who'd graduated from Johns Hopkins, but chosen to practice in a place where she knew every patient's family history and medical needs personally. "The usual to go, please, Frida," Dr. Kim said, checking her watch while mentally reviewing her appointment schedule. "I've got a full day ahead, and Mrs. Peterson's baby decided to arrive 2 weeks early. I need to check on them before my afternoon clinic starts." "Congratulations to the Petersons," Frida said, preparing the doctor's regular order: black coffee, whole wheat toast, and fresh fruit when available. "Boy or girl?" "Healthy girl, 8 pounds even. Mother and baby are both doing great, though Mrs. Peterson's convinced the early arrival means the child will always be impatient." Dr. Kim paused, studying Frida's face with the clinical attention she brought to all her interactions. "You know, in the 3 years I've known you, I don't think I've ever seen you flustered or hurried, even during the lunch rush when we had that bus full of tourists last month. What's your secret?" Frida smiled, an expression that reached her eyes but carried shadows that Dr. Kim couldn't quite interpret. "Practice, I suppose, and the understanding that most problems aren't as urgent as they initially appear." What she didn't say was that her composure came from years of training where panic could mean death. For herself, for her team, for innocent civilians depending on her protection. The Navy SEALs had taught her to remain calm under pressure that most people couldn't imagine, to make life or death decisions while under fire, to maintain focus when everything around her was chaos. Serving breakfast rush at Murphy's Diner was challenging in its own way, but it wasn't life or death. The worst consequence of a mistake was an unhappy customer, not a dead teammate. The afternoon brought its own rhythm, different from the morning's caffeine-fueled urgency. Frida wiped down tables with methodical thoroughness, restocked supplies with the inventory management skills she'd learned maintaining equipment in forward operating bases, and prepared for the evening dinner crowd. Tom Murphy, working beside her to prep vegetables for the day's soup, was a good man in his 60s, who treated his employees well, paid fair wages, and never pried into anyone's personal business unless they volunteered information. "You're a godsend, Frida," Tom said as they worked together, his knife work competent but slower than hers. He'd noticed how efficiently she could break down vegetables, how her cuts were always uniform and precise. "Don't know what I'd do without you," Business has been better these past 3 years than it was for the 5 years before you arrived. You'd manage just fine, Tom, Frida replied, her knife work maintaining the steady rhythm that came from muscle memory earned in field kitchens, where feeding a unit quickly could be the difference between maintaining operational effectiveness and mission failure. You were running this place successfully long before I showed up. Maybe, but not as smoothly. You've got a gift for organization, for seeing what needs to be done before it becomes a problem. That's not something you can teach. Either someone has that kind of awareness, or they don't. Tom was right, though he didn't understand the source of Frida's abilities. Military training had taught her to think systematically, to anticipate problems and develop solutions before situations became critical. In combat, that skill could save lives and ensure mission success. In a restaurant, it meant smoother service, satisfied customers, and a reputation for reliability that kept people coming back. As evening approached, the rain intensified with a persistence that began to feel ominous. What had been a steady drizzle became a downpour that sent diners scurrying for cover and turned the streets into shallow rivers, carrying leaves and debris toward the storm drains. Frida found herself glancing out the windows more frequently, watching the water level in the gutters rise higher than she'd ever seen in her 3 years in Cedar Falls. The sight triggered memories she'd tried to suppress. Monsoon seasons in Afghanistan, where flash floods could wipe out entire villages in minutes. Hurricane deployments in Central America, where she'd helped coordinate evacuations from coastal areas. Water was an enemy she'd faced before, one that didn't discriminate between civilian and combatant, one that killed with indifferent efficiency. The dinner crowd was smaller than usual, people staying home rather than venture out in the deteriorating weather. Those who did come in were locals mostly, familiar faces seeking comfort in warm food and dry surroundings while they waited for the storm to pass. "This is some serious weather," said Bill Richardson, settling into his usual booth with Joe Santos, another longtime resident who worked at the lumber mill. "Haven't seen rain like this since I was a kid. My grandfather used to tell stories about floods in the old days, but I never paid them much attention." "Creek's running mighty high," added Joe, shaking water from his jacket. "Drove across the Main Street Bridge on my way here, and I swear the water's only a couple feet below the roadway. Never seen it like that before." Frida served their meals while part of her attention remained focused on the storm's progression. She'd spent years in places where weather could be an enemy as dangerous as any human foe, and this felt different from ordinary rain. It carried a weight and intensity that spoke of serious trouble building in the mountains upstream from Cedar Falls. By 9 o'clock, the diner was nearly empty except for a few regulars who seemed in no hurry to venture back into the storm. Tom had gone home to his wife, leaving Frida to handle the closing routine she'd performed hundreds of times. As she cleaned the last tables and counted the day's till, the storm continued its relentless assault on the town. The sound of rain on the roof had changed from a gentle patter to a harsh drumming that made conversation difficult and set everyone's nerves on edge. She was locking up when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold and triggered every combat instinct she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder and more ominous with each passing second, building to a crescendo that spoke of massive forces in motion. Frida knew that sound. She'd heard it in Afghanistan during the monsoon season when mountain streams became raging torrents. She'd heard it in Central America during hurricane deployments, when storm surge overwhelmed coastal defenses. She'd heard it in training exercises designed to prepare soldiers for natural disasters that could kill more effectively than enemy action. Flash flood. Her hand was already reaching for her phone before her conscious mind fully processed the threat. She dialed Jake Morrison's number, her fingers moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd made countless emergency calls under pressure. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense with the strain of a man who'd been monitoring weather reports and emergency communications all evening. Jake Morrison. Jake, it's Frida. Are you hearing that sound? Yeah, I'm hearing it. I'm at the station now with both deputies trying to coordinate with the State Emergency Management Office. We've got spotters upstream reporting a wall of water moving through Willow Creek Canyon. Initial estimates put it at 8 to 10 feet high and moving fast. 8 to 10 feet. Frida's mind automatically shifted into tactical mode, the same mental state that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. She began calculating population distribution, evacuation routes, vulnerable locations, available resources, timeline constraints. The analysis was automatic, driven by training that had become instinct. Jake, what's the estimated time to impact for the downtown area? Maybe 20 minutes? Possibly less? The water's moving faster than anyone anticipated, and it's picking up debris that's making it more dangerous and unpredictable. 20 minutes. Frida ran through the tactical situation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under extreme time pressure. The diner sat directly in what would be the flood zone, along with the elementary school where summer programs might still be running, the senior center with its elderly residents who would need assistance evacuating, and at least 24 houses in the low-lying areas near the creek. Jake, do you have an evacuation plan for a scenario like this? There was a pause that told her everything she needed to know. We've got a basic disaster response plan, but Jake's voice trailed off, and Frida heard the unspoken truth. Cedar Falls had never faced anything like this. Their emergency preparations were designed for house fires, medical emergencies, maybe a bad winter storm that knocked out power for a few days, not a flash flood that could wipe out half the town in less than half an hour. I'm coming to help, Frida said, the decision made before she fully realized she was making it. Frida, that's not necessary. The fire department and I can handle. Jake. Her voice carried an authority that cut through his protests like a blade, the command presence that had once led teams of elite soldiers through impossible missions. Trust me on this. I can help. She ended the call and stood in the rain outside Murphy's diner, feeling 3 years of careful anonymity crumbling around her like a wall hit by artillery. The safe, quiet life she'd built in Cedar Falls was about to disappear, washed away by the same floodwaters that threatened her adopted home. But the people of Cedar Falls needed her. Mrs. Henderson, who always asked for strong coffee and shared stories about her late husband. Dr. Kim, who delivered babies and cared for the sick without regard for their ability to pay. Tom Murphy, who'd given her a job and a chance at normalcy when she desperately needed both. All the customers who'd shared their stories, their joys and sorrows, their simple human kindness with a stranger they'd welcomed as one of their own. The transformation began with her posture, shoulders back, stance widening to a combat-ready position she hadn't assumed in 3 years. Her eyes sharpened, taking in tactical details she'd trained herself to ignore during her civilian life. The storm, the terrain, the resources available, the threats developing. Her breathing deepened and slowed to the controlled rhythm she'd learned for managing stress in combat situations. Frida Martinez, waitress, was about to step aside. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Navy SEAL, was about to return to active duty. She had 20 minutes to save a town that had become her home. Given what she'd accomplished in similar time frames during her military career, it would have to be enough.
The Cedar Falls Emergency Services building was controlled chaos when Frida arrived, her truck's wipers struggling against the torrential rain that had turned visibility to mere yards. Sheriff Morrison was trying to coordinate with his 2 deputies while the volunteer fire department prepared rescue equipment they'd trained with but never used in a real emergency. The building's radio crackled constantly with updates from the State Weather Service, each report worse than the last. The flood was moving faster than predicted, and it would be larger than anyone had anticipated.
Frida entered the building and immediately assessed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive through 15 years of military service. 12 people in total. Jake, 2 sheriff's deputies who looked competent but inexperienced with disasters of this magnitude, 6 volunteer firefighters who worked day jobs as mechanics and store clerks, the emergency coordinator who'd held his position for 2 years but never faced anything more serious than a propane truck accident, and 2 civilian volunteers who'd shown up to help but had no specific training. Good people, all of them. But most had never faced anything more serious than a house fire or a multi-car accident on the highway. The kind of people who'd risen to meet smaller challenges but might be overwhelmed by the scale of what was approaching Cedar Falls. "Status report," she said, approaching Jake's desk with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to receiving tactical briefings. Jake looked up, surprised by the authority in her voice. Something fundamental had changed about Frida in the 15 minutes since their phone conversation. She moved differently, purposeful, alert, commanding. Her usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by something harder and more focused, something that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. Upstream spotters report a wall of water about 8 feet high moving through Willow Creek Canyon, Jake said, consulting his hastily scrawled notes. At current speed, it'll hit the north end of town in about 12 to 15 minutes. We're trying to get warnings out through the emergency broadcast system, but you don't have an effective mass notification system for immediate alerts, Frida finished, her eyes already studying the emergency operations map mounted on the wall. And your evacuation plans weren't designed for this scenario or this timeline. "How did you—" Jake started, then stopped, looking at her with new recognition. "Frida, what's going on here? You're talking like someone with extensive experience in disaster management and emergency operations." The room fell silent except for the radio chatter and the sound of rain hammering the roof with increasing intensity. Jake's deputies, both young men who'd grown up in Cedar Falls and joined law enforcement to serve their community, stared at her with expressions of surprise and growing hope. The volunteer firefighters stopped their equipment checks to listen, sensing that something significant was happening. "Because I do have that experience," Frida said, meeting Jake's eyes steadily. "Staff Sergeant Frida Martinez, United States Navy SEALs, retired. 15 years of active service, including disaster relief operations in 4 countries, combat search and rescue, and emergency evacuation coordination." The silence that followed was profound. Deputy Wilson, barely 25 and 2 years out of the police academy, whispered, "SEALs? Like actual Navy SEALs? "We can discuss my service record later," Frida said sharply, her voice carrying the command authority that had once directed teams of elite soldiers through complex operations. "Right now, we have a town to evacuate and lives to save. Jake, I need you to trust me and give me operational authority for this emergency. Can you do that?" Jake Morrison had been a cop for 30 years and a soldier before that during his brief stint in the National Guard. He recognized command presence when he heard it. And right now, Frida Martinez sounded like someone who'd led men and women through hell and brought them home alive. More importantly, she sounded like someone who knew exactly what needed to be done, while everyone else was still trying to understand the scope of the problem. "What do you need?" he asked without hesitation. Frida moved to the emergency operations map, studying the town's layout with the professional efficiency of someone trained to assess tactical situations rapidly and accurately. Her finger traced Cedar Creek's path through Cedar Falls, identifying choke points, vulnerable areas, and potential staging areas for evacuation operations. "First priority is the senior center," she said, tapping the location on the map. 43 residents, according to my last count, most with mobility issues. They're directly in the flood path and can't evacuate quickly on their own. Evacuation needs to begin immediately. She turned to Rodriguez, the volunteer fire chief who ran the local hardware store when he wasn't fighting fires. He was a competent man who'd served his community faithfully for 15 years, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he faced the biggest emergency of his career. Chief Rodriguez, how many vehicles do you have available that can transport multiple passengers safely? 2 fire trucks, 1 rescue vehicle, and my personal pickup, Rodriguez replied, his voice steady despite the pressure. The rescue truck can handle maybe 8 people if some of them can sit on the floor. Not nearly enough for 43 people with limited time, Frida said, her mind already calculating alternatives. We need to commandeer additional vehicles immediately. School buses, delivery trucks, anything with capacity. She turned to Deputy Wilson, whose youth might be an advantage in this situation. You grew up here. Who has vehicles we can requisition for emergency use? The school district has 4 buses parked at the maintenance yard, Wilson replied, his training kicking in as he focused on the specific question rather than the overwhelming nature of the crisis. Miller Construction has 2 crew transport trucks. The Methodist Church has a 15-passenger van. The college might have some vehicles available. Excellent. Get on the radio immediately and contact all of them. Tell them we have a federal emergency declaration in effect and we need immediate assistance with civilian evacuation. Lives are at stake, and we need those vehicles mobilized within 10 minutes. Frida's attention shifted to Peterson, the emergency coordinator who looked overwhelmed but determined to help. Do you have current resident lists for the senior center? Names, medical conditions, mobility status? Yes, ma'am. It's all in the emergency files updated monthly. Get those files now. I need to know exactly who we're evacuating and what special needs they might have. Her voice brooked no argument, carrying the expectation of immediate compliance that came from years of commanding soldiers in high-stress situations. Jake watched in amazement as Frida took control of the chaotic situation with military precision. Within 5 minutes, she'd organized the entire operation with an efficiency that would have taken his team an hour to achieve, and she'd done it while maintaining the calm authority that kept everyone focused on solutions rather than problems. Jake, Frida said, studying the map again with the systematic attention she'd once brought to mission planning, what about the elementary school? Any overnight activities, summer programs, extended daycare? Summer art camp runs until 6, but they should be gone by now. Let me check. Jake made a quick phone call to the school. His expression grew grim as he listened to the response. 20 kids and 4 counselors are still there. They were waiting for parents to pick them up, but some families are running late because of the weather. Frida nodded, adding the school to her mental list of evacuation priorities. They're on slightly higher ground than the senior center, which gives us a buffer, but we'll need to evacuate them as well. She traced another route on the map with practiced efficiency. What's the condition of Miller Road for heavy vehicle access? Should be passable unless the water's already backing up from the creek. We'll find out. Rodriguez, I need your best driver to take the rescue truck to the elementary school. Load the children first, then the counselors. If water is already rising around the building, don't attempt a ground-level evacuation. Radio immediately for assistance and consider alternate extraction methods. Rodriguez nodded, assigning the task to his most experienced volunteer with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned to trust Frida's expertise in the span of 10 minutes. Frida continued issuing orders with the systematic precision of someone accustomed to life or death decision-making under extreme time pressure. She divided the available personnel into teams, assigned specific objectives to each, and established communication protocols that would keep everyone coordinated as the situation developed. The chaos that had filled the emergency services building when she arrived began to resolve into organized action. "What about you?" Jake asked as the teams prepared to deploy. "Where are you going to be?" Frida was already putting on a rain jacket she'd borrowed from the emergency supplies, checking its pockets for basic equipment she might need. "I'm going to the senior center with the first evacuation team. Those people will be scared and confused. They need someone who can keep them calm and organized during the evacuation process." "Frida," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of one professional for another. "I don't know what happened to make you leave the military and end up in Cedar Falls, but I'm damn grateful you're here tonight." For a moment, her professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain that had driven her to seek anonymity in a small Montana town. Sometimes running away from something leads you to exactly where you need to be. The ride to the senior center was a nightmare journey through streets that were transforming from familiar neighborhoods into dangerous waterways. Frida rode in the lead fire truck with Rodriguez and 2 volunteers, watching the streets she'd walked peacefully for 3 years become unrecognizable landscapes of rushing water and debris. The rain continued with unrelenting intensity, and water was already ankle-deep in the low-lying areas, carrying branches, garbage cans, and pieces of buildings toward the swollen creek. "Jesus Christ," muttered one of the volunteers, a young man named Danny Santos who'd never seen anything like the devastation developing around them. "I never imagined it could get this bad this fast." "Stay focused on the mission," Frida said calmly, her voice cutting through the noise of rain and engine. "We've got people counting on us, and panic doesn't help anyone. Focus on what we can control." The senior center sat on a slight rise that had seemed insignificant during normal times, but now represented the difference between safety and disaster. Water was already lapping at the front steps when they arrived, and through the windows, Frida could see residents gathered in the main lounge. Some were in wheelchairs, others used walkers or canes, and most looked frightened and confused by the disruption to their carefully ordered routines. "Rodriguez, position the truck as close to the front entrance as possible," Frida ordered, already planning the evacuation sequence in her mind. "We need to minimize the distance people have to travel through the water, especially those with mobility limitations." She jumped down from the truck before it fully stopped, splashing through 6 inches of muddy water that was rising visibly as she watched. The current was already strong enough to make walking treacherous, and she could see debris flowing past that could knock someone down or cause serious injury. The automatic doors had failed due to power fluctuations caused by the storm, so Frida forced them open manually and stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was controlled panic. 43 elderly residents, many suffering from dementia or mobility issues, surrounded by a staff of 6 who were doing their best but were clearly overwhelmed by the unprecedented situation. "I'm Frida Martinez," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "I'm here with the emergency services to evacuate everyone safely. We have vehicles outside, and we're going to transport everyone to the high school gymnasium where it's safe and dry." Mrs. Henderson, who'd been asking for strong coffee just that morning in what now seemed like a different lifetime, looked up from her wheelchair with frightened eyes. "Frida, dear, what's happening?" "They said something about flooding, but I don't understand." "The creek has never been a problem before." "The creek has risen more than usual due to the heavy rain, Mrs. Henderson," Frida said gently, kneeling beside the elderly woman's wheelchair and taking her hand. "But we're going to take care of everyone. I need you to trust me and help keep the other residents calm. Can you do that for me?" Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from fear to determination. Despite her age and frailty, she'd lived through the Great Depression and World War II. She understood crisis and the importance of maintaining morale during difficult times. Of course, dear. What do you need us to do? Frida stood and addressed the entire room again, her military training taking over completely as she shifted into operational mode. I need everyone to listen carefully. We're going to evacuate in groups based on mobility needs. Wheelchair users first, then anyone with walkers or other assistance devices, then everyone who can walk independently. Staff members will help coordinate, and each person will be assigned a buddy to ensure no one gets separated or left behind. The senior center's director, Janet Coleman, was a competent woman in her 50s who'd managed the facility for 8 years but had never faced anything approaching this level of emergency. She approached Frida with obvious relief, recognizing competent leadership when she saw it. "Thank God you're here," Janet said, her voice shaking slightly with the stress of the situation. "We've never dealt with anything like this, and some of the residents are getting agitated. A few with dementia are becoming confused and resistant to instructions. That's completely normal," Frida assured her, drawing on her experience with civilian evacuations during her military service. Fear and confusion make people act unpredictably, especially when their routines are disrupted. The key is to project calm authority and give people specific tasks to focus on. She turned to survey the room, her experienced eye cataloging the challenges they faced. "How many of your residents have dementia or other cognitive impairments that might make evacuation difficult?" "About 15, in varying degrees of severity." "They'll need special attention during the evacuation process. Pair each one with a staff member or volunteer. Don't let anyone wander off or become separated from their assigned buddy. Use simple, clear instructions and maintain physical contact when possible to provide reassurance." As Frida organized the evacuation with military efficiency, her professional competence had a calming effect on both residents and staff. She moved through the room with quiet authority, speaking to individual residents, assessing their specific needs, and coordinating with the volunteers who were preparing to load people into vehicles. The first group, 8 wheelchair users, including Mrs. Henderson, were successfully loaded onto the fire truck when Deputy Wilson's voice crackled over the radio with an update that changed everything. "All units be advised. Water level is rising faster than predicted. Upstream spotters report additional debris dams have failed. We've got maybe 8 minutes before the senior center is completely surrounded by flood water. 8 minutes." Frida absorbed this information without visible reaction, but her mind immediately began recalculating the evacuation timeline with the cold precision of someone trained to adapt to changing tactical situations. 43 residents, limited vehicles, rising water, and 8 minutes. The mathematics were challenging, but not impossible if they executed flawlessly. "Change of plan," she announced to her team, her voice cutting through the increased urgency without betraying panic. "We're not waiting for vehicles to make round trips. Everyone goes in the next load, whatever it takes. Rodriguez, radio for additional vehicles immediately. We need everything with wheels that can carry people." Rodriguez looked doubtful as he consulted his passenger capacity calculations. "Frida, we don't have enough space. The remaining truck can handle maybe 12 more people if we pack them in, and we've still got 35 residents here." "Then we make it work," Frida replied firmly. "We overload the vehicles, we make multiple rapid trips with the same vehicle, or we find alternative transportation, but we don't leave anyone behind." Her tone carried the absolute certainty of someone who'd made similar impossible commitments during combat operations and fulfilled them through sheer determination and tactical flexibility. One of the volunteers, Danny Santos, raised his hand hesitantly. "My brother Joe works late shift at the logging company. They've got those big crew transport trucks that can carry 20 workers each, if he's still there." "Contact him immediately," Frida ordered. "Tell him we have a life-threatening emergency and need immediate assistance with civilian evacuation. Use whatever words you need to get him here in the next 5 minutes. As Danny made the call, Frida continued organizing the remaining residents with the systematic efficiency that had once made her one of the military's most effective small unit leaders. She grouped them by mobility level, identified those who would need special assistance during transport, and briefed the staff on modified evacuation procedures that would accommodate the compressed timeline. Her calm efficiency helped keep panic at bay, even as the sound of rushing water grew louder outside and the building's lights flickered ominously. Several residents with dementia were becoming agitated by the disruption, but Frida's steady presence and clear instructions provided the anchor of authority they needed to remain manageable. Joe Santos arrived with a logging company crew truck just as water began flowing around the building's foundation, with enough force to make walking dangerous. The truck was designed to transport workers to remote job sites and could carry 20 passengers in its covered bed, though not with anything approaching comfort. "Thank God," Janet Coleman whispered, watching the large vehicle navigate through the rising water to reach the building. "Load the most mobile residents first," Frida ordered, her voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "Staff helps anyone who needs assistance. Rodriguez, keep your truck available for wheelchair users and anyone with serious mobility issues who can't manage the climb into the crew truck." The evacuation proceeded with military precision, each resident assigned to a specific vehicle and buddy system. Frida personally assisted Mrs. Henderson and several other familiar faces from Murphy's Diner, offering reassurance while maintaining the calm authority that kept people focused on following instructions rather than succumbing to panic. As the last residents were loaded, water was flowing around the vehicle's tires with enough force to make Frida concerned about their ability to drive safely back to higher ground. The senior center's first floor was now completely flooded, and the current was strong enough to knock a standing person off their feet. "That's everyone," Janet called out, consulting her clipboard one final time. All 43 residents accounted for and loaded. Frida did a final sweep of the building, checking every room to ensure no one had been left behind. It was a habit from military operations where leaving anyone behind was unthinkable, and thoroughness could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The convoy's journey back to the high school was treacherous, with Frida riding in the lead vehicle to guide the route through streets that were becoming increasingly impassable. She used hand signals and radio coordination to direct the vehicles around obstacles and through the safest paths available. As they pulled into the high school parking lot, now partially underwater but still accessible, Mrs. Henderson reached over and took Frida's hand with the gentle strength of someone who'd lived through many crises. "Dear," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of 8 decades, "I don't know who you really are or what you did before you came to Cedar Falls, but you saved our lives tonight. All of us. We won't forget that." Frida squeezed the elderly woman's hand gently, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Mrs. Henderson. Just someone who cares about this town and the people in it." But even as she spoke, Frida knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. The woman who'd served coffee and cleaned tables for 3 years was gone, washed away by the same flood that was transforming Cedar Falls. In her place was someone she'd tried hard to forget. A warrior trained to protect others, someone who couldn't stand by while people were in danger. The convoy reached the high school, just as reports came in over the radio confirming that the elementary school had been successfully evacuated, with all 20 children and 4 counselors safe and accounted for. But the flood was still rising, water levels exceeding all predictions, and other areas of town were now reporting emergencies. Frida's night of heroism had only just begun, and the most dangerous challenges still lay ahead.
The Cedar Falls High School gymnasium had been transformed into an emergency shelter with remarkable efficiency. Cots borrowed from the National Guard Armory lined the basketball court in organized rows, while volunteers distributed blankets, food, and comfort to the evacuated residents. The senior center evacuees were settling in, as well as could be expected, though many remained confused and frightened by the sudden upheaval of their carefully structured routines. Frida moved through the shelter with the purposeful efficiency of someone conducting a post-operation assessment, checking on the people she'd helped evacuate while monitoring radio communications from the emergency command post. The immediate crisis at the senior center had been resolved successfully, but the flood continued to rise throughout Cedar Falls, and new emergencies were developing faster than the limited resources could address them. "Frida, thank goodness you're here." Dr. Sarah Kim approached, carrying a medical bag and wearing the expression of someone overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her normal experience. "I've got 3 evacuees with serious medical conditions that need constant monitoring, and I'm the only doctor available. The hospital in Billings is dealing with their own flood situation, so we're on our own. Can you help me set up a temporary medical station?" "Of course," Frida replied, following Dr. Kim to a corner of the gymnasium where they began arranging cots and medical supplies with systematic efficiency. "What are we dealing with specifically?" "Mr. Peterson from the senior center is having chest pains, possible cardiac event brought on by the stress of evacuation. Mrs. Rodriguez has severe diabetes, and we need to monitor her blood sugar levels constantly. And little Amy Chen from the art camp has asthma, and she's having difficulty breathing in this humidity and stress environment." Frida helped organize the medical area with the same methodical approach she'd applied to the evacuation, drawing on basic field medic training that had been part of her military education. Her knowledge was elementary compared to Dr. Kim's medical expertise, but she understood triage procedures, patient monitoring, and how to assist during medical emergencies under less than ideal conditions. "You have medical training," Dr. Kim observed as they worked together to stabilize Mr. Peterson, whose color was improving under professional care. "Field medic certification, basic trauma response," Frida replied, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Nothing approaching your level of expertise, but enough to be useful in situations like this." As they monitored the patients, Frida's radio crackled with urgent updates from the command post that painted an increasingly dire picture of the situation developing across Cedar Falls. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the static with news that made her blood run cold. "All units, we've got a new critical situation developing. The water treatment plant is flooding rapidly. If we lose it completely, the entire town will be without clean water for weeks, possibly months." Frida handed patient monitoring duties to a volunteer nurse who'd arrived from the college and stepped away to respond. The treatment plant was critical infrastructure that served not just Cedar Falls, but several smaller communities in the valley. Its loss would create a humanitarian crisis extending far beyond the immediate flood damage. "Jake, what's the current status at the plant?" "2 employees are trapped inside the main building. Rising water has cut off their normal escape route, and they're currently on the 2nd floor. But water levels are still rising, and the building's structural integrity is becoming questionable. What resources do you have available for rescue operations?" "That's the problem." Jake's voice carried the frustration of someone facing impossible choices with inadequate resources. "The fire department's boat is at the elementary school area helping with evacuations there. State emergency services promised helicopter support, but it's grounded due to weather conditions. We're looking at a ground rescue through active flood waters."
Frida studied the rain lashing against the gymnasium windows with professional assessment. The storm showed no signs of abating, and weather conditions were actually deteriorating rather than stabilizing. Every minute of delay increased the danger for the trapped employees while simultaneously making rescue operations more hazardous. "Jake, I'm returning to the command post to assist with rescue planning." "Frida, you've done enough for one night. You should rest while you can." "Those people need help now, not after I've rested," she replied, already moving toward the exit. "And I have the training and experience for exactly this kind of rescue operation." Dr. Kim looked up from her patients with concern written across her features. Frida, whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful. This town needs you, and we can't afford to lose you to heroics. I'll be back, Doc. Keep everyone safe here. The drive back to the emergency command post was increasingly treacherous, as streets that had been merely flooded an hour earlier were now raging rivers, carrying debris that could crush or disable a vehicle. Frida's borrowed emergency services truck struggled through water that reached its wheel wells, the engine laboring against currents that threatened to sweep the vehicle off course. She'd made this same drive hundreds of times as a civilian, heading to work at Murphy's Diner or running routine errands around town. But tonight, familiar streets had become an alien landscape of destruction and danger. Buildings she knew well were flooded to their second floors. Cars floated past like boats, their owners' lives literally washed away by forces beyond anyone's control. At the command post, the situation had deteriorated significantly since her departure. 2 more areas of town were experiencing severe flooding, stretching the limited emergency resources beyond their effective capacity. Jake Morrison looked like a man carrying impossible weight, trying to coordinate responses to multiple simultaneous crises, with resources designed for single emergencies. Status report on the treatment plant situation, Frida said, without preamble, studying the tactical maps that showed water levels rising throughout the affected areas. Water has reached the second floor of the main building, Jake replied, consulting updates from field teams. The 2 employees, Jim Patterson and Maria Santos, both experienced plant operators, are now on the roof. But water levels are still rising, and the building's electrical systems have failed completely. We estimate they have maybe 20 minutes before the roof is no longer safe. Frida studied the tactical map with professional attention, noting the plant's location relative to current water levels, accessible routes, and potential staging areas for rescue operations. The situation was challenging, but manageable for someone with appropriate training and equipment. Do you have waterproof communication gear available? Rescue ropes, emergency flotation devices, basic water rescue equipment? Some, Jake replied, gesturing toward the emergency supply cabinet. But Frida, I can't officially ask you to risk your life for this operation. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. You're not asking, Frida said, meeting his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd made similar decisions many times under combat conditions. I'm volunteering. Those people didn't choose to be in danger, but I am choosing to help them. That's my decision to make. Deputy Wilson, who'd been monitoring radio communications, looked up with urgent news. Sheriff, we just lost all communication with the treatment plant. Their emergency radio went completely dead. Electrical failure, Frida said grimly, her mind already calculating the implications. Which means their situation just became significantly worse. They're cut off from communication, probably without power, and facing rising water levels. Jake, we need to move immediately. Take Rodriguez with you for backup, Jake decided after a moment's consideration, and maintain constant radio contact with the command post. If the situation becomes too dangerous, abort the mission immediately. We can't afford to lose anyone else tonight. Frida knew better than to make promises she might not be able to keep. In her experience, rescue operations often required choosing between acceptable risk and certain failure. But she nodded agreement anyway, understanding that Jake needed to believe he was authorizing a manageable mission rather than a potentially suicidal rescue attempt. The rescue boat was a 12-foot aluminum hull with an outboard motor, designed for recreational lake fishing rather than flood rescue operations in dangerous conditions. But it was the only watercraft immediately available, so it would have to be sufficient. Rodriguez helped her load rescue equipment while she studied topographical maps of the route to the treatment plant, identifying potential hazards and alternative approaches. You really think we can navigate through this flood to reach them? Rodriguez asked, eyeing the turbulent water that now covered Main Street and was carrying debris that could disable or destroy their small boat. Getting there isn't the primary problem, Frida replied, checking the boat's emergency supplies and safety equipment. The challenge will be getting back with 3 people in a boat designed for 2, especially if weather conditions continue to deteriorate. They launched the boat from what had been the high school parking lot, now partially underwater, but still accessible for small watercraft. The outboard motor struggled against the powerful current, forcing Frida to navigate carefully to avoid debris and submerged obstacles that could puncture the hull or damage the propeller. The trip to the treatment plant normally took 5 minutes by car on dry roads. In the flood conditions, fighting current and debris while maintaining safe navigation, it required 20 minutes of intense concentration and skilled boat handling. Frida used techniques learned during maritime operations, reading the water's flow patterns and anticipating hazards before they became immediate threats. "There," Rodriguez called out, pointing through the rain toward a cluster of partially submerged buildings. The treatment plant complex. The Cedar Falls water treatment plant was a modern facility designed to serve the town's needs for decades into the future. But it had never been engineered to withstand a flash flood of this unprecedented magnitude. Water covered the first floor completely and was rising steadily toward the second-floor windows, while debris collected against the building created additional hazards for navigation. Frida maneuvered the boat around the main building, looking for the safest approach to the roof where Jim Patterson and Maria Santos were stranded. The current was stronger here, accelerated by the building's obstruction of natural water flow, and debris was accumulating in patterns that could trap their boat. "Frida, Rodriguez, come in." Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "What's your current status?" "At the treatment plant now," Rodriguez replied, his voice tense as he watched debris flow past their boat. "Water level is higher than anticipated, but we can see 2 people on the roof of the main building." Frida studied the building's architecture, looking for the best way to execute the rescue safely and efficiently. The roof was accessible only by an external maintenance ladder, but the ladder was now partially submerged and would be slippery and extremely dangerous to use in current conditions. "Rodriguez, I need you to hold the boat steady against the current while I go up to get them," she said, securing her safety rope and preparing for the most dangerous part of the operation. "Frida, that ladder is barely above water level now. One slip and you'll be swept away by the current." "I've climbed worse things in worse conditions," she replied with the quiet confidence of someone who'd executed similar rescues under combat conditions. "Just keep the boat positioned for quick departure once we're all aboard." The ladder was indeed treacherous, wet, covered with algae, and buffeted by wind that threatened to tear her grip loose with each gust. But Frida's training had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge. She climbed steadily upward, focusing on each handhold and footstep, while the flood raged below and debris crashed against the building around her. Jim Patterson and Maria Santos were huddled together on the roof, both soaked through and shivering from cold and fear, but apparently uninjured. They were longtime employees of the treatment plant, dedicated workers who'd stayed at their posts, trying to protect the town's water supply until the rising flood made evacuation impossible. "Are you folks hurt?" Frida asked, quickly assessing their condition for injuries or medical emergencies. "No, we're okay, but we can't swim," Maria replied, her voice shaking with cold and accumulated stress. "When the water started rising fast, we got trapped on the upper floor. Then it kept coming up, and we had to climb out here. We thought we were going to die." "Well, you're not going to die tonight," Frida assured them, with the calm authority that had once steadied soldiers under fire. "We've got a boat down there, and we're getting you out of this situation." but I need both of you to follow my instructions exactly and trust me completely. Can you do that?" Both employees nodded emphatically, their relief obvious as they realized rescue had actually arrived. The descent was significantly more challenging than the climb up had been. Frida had to help both employees down the slippery ladder while managing her own safety equipment and coordinating with Rodriguez to keep the boat positioned properly. The process was slow, methodical, and extremely dangerous, with margin for error essentially zero. Maria went first, guided by Frida's steady instructions and physical assistance when needed. The elderly woman's fear made her movements jerky and unpredictable, but Frida's calm voice and firm guidance helped her maintain focus on the task rather than the danger. When Maria finally reached the boat, Rodriguez helped her aboard and got her settled as safely as possible. Jim Patterson was younger and stronger, but the psychological stress of the situation had affected his judgment and coordination. Halfway down the ladder, he made the mistake of looking down at the rushing water below and froze completely. "I can't do this," he called up to Frida, his voice tight with panic. "I'm going to fall." "The water's too fast, too dangerous." "No, you're not going to fall," Frida replied firmly, using the command voice that had once talked soldiers through impossible situations. "Look at me, Jim." "Don't look at the water. Look directly at me. You're doing fine. Just take it one step at a time." Using techniques learned during combat rescue operations, Frida talked Jim through each movement while maintaining physical contact to provide reassurance and guidance. Her voice remained calm and authoritative, cutting through his panic with clear, simple instructions that gave him specific tasks to focus on, rather than the overwhelming danger of the situation. When Jim finally reached the boat, all three occupants were safely aboard, but they now faced the equally dangerous journey back to shore through increasingly turbulent floodwaters that had worsened during the rescue operation. "Rodriguez, radio the command post," Frida ordered as she started the outboard motor, which coughed and sputtered before catching. "Tell them we have both treatment plant employees, both uninjured, and we're beginning the return journey." The trip back towards safety was a nightmare of navigation through conditions that had deteriorated significantly. The boat, now carrying 4 people instead of its intended capacity of 2, rode dangerously low in the water and responded sluggishly to steering inputs. Debris had increased dramatically during their rescue operation. Entire trees, sections of buildings, abandoned vehicles, all carried by the flood's relentless current toward the downstream areas. Frida used every skill she'd learned in maritime operations, reading the water's patterns to anticipate obstacles before they became immediate threats. Rodriguez watched their flanks, calling out hazards while maintaining radio contact with shore-based teams who were tracking their progress. "Large debris field ahead," Rodriguez warned, pointing toward what looked like the remains of Miller Construction's equipment yard. "Looks like lumber, machinery, maybe some vehicles." Frida adjusted course, threading the boat between floating construction materials and heavy equipment with precision that impressed even herself. The margin for error was essentially zero. One collision could disable their boat and put all 4 lives at immediate risk in the rushing flood waters. Halfway back to the high school, the outboard motor began to sputter ominously. Frida felt her stomach drop as she recognized the symptoms of water contamination in the fuel system. The motor was beginning to fail, just like everything else in Cedar Falls was failing under the relentless assault of the flood. "What's wrong with the engine?" Maria asked, hearing the motor's distress over the sound of wind and rain. "Minor mechanical issues," Frida replied calmly, not wanting to panic her passengers when they were still in significant danger. "Rodriguez, break out the emergency paddles. We may need to finish this trip the old-fashioned way." The motor died completely just as they reached the outskirts of the downtown flood zone, where the current was strongest and most unpredictable. Frida and Rodriguez began paddling with systematic efficiency, while Jim Patterson, having recovered from his earlier panic, helped navigate using a handheld GPS unit that was somehow still functional. "This looks like a war zone," Jim observed, watching familiar buildings slide past underwater while debris crashed against partially submerged obstacles. "It is a war zone," Frida replied, her paddles cutting through the muddy water with mechanical precision born of training and determination. "We're at war with natural forces that don't care about human plans or preparations. And right now, nature has most of the advantages." But they were making steady progress despite the mechanical failure. The high school's emergency lights were visible through the rain and darkness, and radio communication with Jake Morrison confirmed that other rescue operations were proceeding successfully throughout the affected areas. The elementary school evacuation had been completed without casualties, and several stranded families had been retrieved by other boat teams. As they approached the high school's improvised boat landing, Frida could see volunteers waiting to help with their arrival. Dr. Sarah Kim was among them, along with Jake Morrison and several others who'd been monitoring the rescue operation through radio communications and growing increasingly concerned as mechanical problems extended the return journey. "Thank God you made it back safely," Dr. Kim called out as their boat reached the makeshift dock. "We were getting seriously worried when we lost radio contact for a while and heard about your engine problems." Jim Patterson and Maria Santos were helped ashore and immediately surrounded by blankets and hot coffee, both exhausted but unharmed and profoundly grateful to be alive and safe. The successful rescue had been a textbook example of what could be accomplished with proper training, adequate equipment, and people willing to take calculated risks to help others. "What about the treatment plant itself?" Jake asked quietly, as Frida secured the boat and gathered the rescue equipment. "Total loss," she replied without hesitation. "First floor completely flooded, all electrical systems destroyed, and water levels are still rising. It'll be weeks before the flooding subsides enough to assess structural damage, and months before it's operational again, assuming the building is even salvageable." Jake nodded grimly, absorbing the implications. The loss of the water treatment plant was a devastating blow to Cedar Falls that would affect the entire community for months to come. But it would have been infinitely worse to lose 2 more lives along with the infrastructure. "Frida," Maria Santos approached, still wrapped in an emergency blanket, but determined to express her gratitude personally. "I don't know who you really are or where you came from, but you saved our lives tonight. Jim and I, we both have families, grandchildren we thought we'd never see again. Because of what you did, we're going to go home to them." "Just doing what needed to be done," Frida replied, but she accepted the older woman's heartfelt embrace. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from using her specialized skills to protect innocent people. The feeling she'd tried so hard to suppress since leaving military service. Dr. Kim conducted brief medical examinations of the treatment plant employees, while Frida gave her detailed report to Jake Morrison. The flood was finally beginning to crest, according to upstream measurements, though water levels wouldn't drop significantly for many hours. The immediate crisis phase was ending, but the recovery period would be long and challenging. "How many people have we successfully evacuated tonight?" Jake asked, tallying the various rescue operations. 43 from the senior center, 20 from the elementary school, 2 from the treatment plant," Frida calculated, adding up the numbers with precision. "Plus, maybe a dozen others from individual rescues scattered around town. 77 lives, give or take a few. 77 people who are alive tonight because you walked into that emergency services building and took operational control," Jake corrected her. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and I've never witnessed anything like what you accomplished tonight." Frida looked around the gymnasium, now filled with evacuees from across Cedar Falls representing every segment of the community. families huddled together on emergency cots, children sleeping despite the chaos and noise, elderly residents playing cards to pass the anxious hours. Mrs. Henderson was holding court in one corner, telling stories to anyone who would listen and maintaining morale through sheer force of personality. These were her people now, she realized with sudden clarity. Not because of any military chain of command or operational orders, but because she'd chosen to make Cedar Falls her home, and they'd accepted her as family. She'd tried to hide from her past and her capabilities, but tonight had proved that some things couldn't be hidden forever when lives were at stake. "Jake," she said quietly, watching Dr. Kim move among the evacuees providing medical care and comfort. "We need to start planning immediately for the recovery phase. This flood is going to fundamentally change everything about how this town operates. You're absolutely right. And I think we're going to need someone with your experience and expertise to help coordinate the rebuilding effort. The state will send people, but they won't understand this community the way you do." Frida considered this possibility as she watched the people of Cedar Falls supporting each other through the crisis. The safe, anonymous life she'd built over 3 years was gone, washed away by the same waters that had revealed her true nature and capabilities. But maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it was time to stop running from who she was and start using her abilities to build something better for the future. The night was far from over, and greater challenges still lay ahead as Cedar Falls faced the long road to recovery. But for the first time in 3 years, Frida Martinez felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Dawn came gray and sodden to Cedar Falls, revealing the full extent of the flood's devastation through the gymnasium windows where exhausted evacuees were finally beginning to rest. From her position near the emergency medical station, Frida could see a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Familiar streets turned into debris-filled canals, buildings half submerged like monuments to nature's power, vehicles piled against bridge abutments like children's toys, abandoned by a careless giant. She'd caught perhaps 2 hours of sleep, spending most of the night moving between evacuees, assisting Dr. Kim with medical concerns, and coordinating with Jake Morrison on immediate recovery priorities. Her borrowed emergency services jacket was still damp from the night's operations, her boots caked with mud from floodwaters, but she felt more centered and purposeful than she had in 3 years of civilian life. Mrs. Henderson approached slowly, using her walker, but determined to reach Frida personally despite the early hour. The elderly woman's eyes held the sharp intelligence that had served her through 8 decades of life, including the Great Depression and World War II. "Dear," Mrs. Henderson said, settling carefully into a folding chair beside Frida, "I wanted to thank you properly. Not just for last night, though Lord knows that was something extraordinary, but for these past 3 years. You've been taking care of all of us in ways we didn't even recognize, and we never knew it. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Henderson. This community became my home, and you all became my family. Taking care of family is just what people do." "Is it really your home, though?" The elderly woman's eyes were shrewd despite her age and the trauma of the previous night. "Because the woman who served my coffee yesterday morning was kind and careful, but she was hiding from something. The woman who saved my life last night, she was someone completely different. Someone who belonged here in ways the other woman never allowed herself to." Before Frida could formulate a response to this uncomfortably accurate observation, Jake Morrison's voice echoed across the gymnasium as he called for everyone's attention. The evacuees gathered around as he outlined the immediate situation facing Cedar Falls in the aftermath of the flood. The damage was extensive and would take months to fully catalog. Most of downtown Cedar Falls remained underwater, and many buildings would be uninhabitable for weeks or possibly months while repairs were completed. The water treatment plant was completely destroyed. Power lines were down across half the town, and the main bridge over Cedar Creek had suffered structural damage that made it unsafe for vehicle traffic. We're going to need significant help from state and federal emergency management agencies, Jake continued, consulting notes he'd compiled from overnight damage assessments. But in the immediate term, we need to take care of ourselves and each other. That means organizing volunteer teams for damage assessment, coordinating with relief agencies, and planning for temporary housing arrangements for displaced families. What about Murphy's Diner? Called out Tom Murphy, who'd arrived at dawn to check on his employees and assess the damage to his family's business. How bad is the situation there? Jake consulted his damage reports, compiled from reconnaissance teams that had been working throughout the night. The first floor took approximately 4 feet of water. Kitchen equipment, furniture, electrical systems, everything on the ground level will need complete replacement. But the building structure appears sound, and the second floor wasn't affected. Tom's face reflected the crushing weight of financial loss. The diner represented 3 generations of his family's work, and while insurance would cover some losses, it wouldn't address the months of lost income during rebuilding or the emotional cost of seeing his life's work destroyed. Tom, Frida said, approaching the group with an idea that had been developing during her conversations with other evacuees. What if we didn't wait for complete repairs? What if we set up temporary food service operations to support the recovery workers and volunteers? Use the high school kitchen facilities? Partner with local suppliers who can still operate? Keep people fed while the town rebuilds itself? You think something like that could actually work? I think this town is going to be full of hungry people doing physically demanding work for the next 6 months. Someone needs to coordinate feeding them, and you have the expertise to do it right. It was the beginning of a conversation that would reshape Cedar Falls in ways none of them could anticipate. Over the following hours, as state emergency management teams arrived and began coordinating official relief efforts, the people of Cedar Falls discovered something remarkable about their quiet waitress who'd saved so many lives. Frida Martinez possessed an almost supernatural ability to organize complex logistical operations under challenging conditions. She coordinated volunteer teams with military precision, established communication networks that kept vital information flowing efficiently, and identified resource needs before they became critical shortages that could hamper recovery efforts. Where exactly did you learn to manage operations like this? Asked Janet Coleman, the senior center director who'd witnessed Frida's transformation from waitress to emergency commander during the previous night's evacuations. Experience in challenging environments, Frida replied simply, not wanting to elaborate on her military background more than necessary. The less attention she drew to her past, the better. But word was spreading throughout the community, despite her attempts at discretion. The story of the waitress, who'd turned out to be a decorated Navy SEAL, was too dramatic for a small town to keep confidential. By noon, when the first news crews arrived from Billings and Bozeman to document the flood's aftermath, reporters were asking specifically about the local hero who organized the life-saving evacuations. Frida tried to avoid the cameras and interviews, but Jake Morrison had different ideas about her public profile. The people of Cedar Falls deserve to know who saved their lives, he told her as they stood outside the emergency command post that had been relocated to the high school's administrative offices. Jake, I really don't want media attention or publicity. I came to Cedar Falls specifically to get away from all that kind of scrutiny. I understand your desire for privacy, but these people, your neighbors and friends, they've been wondering about you for 3 years. They deserve to know who you really are, especially after what you did for them. The press conference was brief and uncomfortable for Frida, who answered questions about the previous night's operations in clinical, professional terms while downplaying her own role and emphasizing the teamwork of local emergency services. But the reporters had conducted their own research, and one of them asked the question she'd been dreading since the cameras arrived. Ms. Martinez, we've confirmed through military records that you served with the Navy SEALs for 15 years, including multiple combat deployments in classified operations. Can you tell us what led you to leave military service and end up working as a waitress in a small Montana town? The question hit like a physical blow, triggering the familiar tightness in her chest and the involuntary response to memories she'd worked desperately to suppress. The nightmare mission that had ended her career, the intelligence failures that had cost lives, the teammates who died because information that should have been reliable turned out to be fatally compromised. I served my country for 15 years in various capacities, she said carefully, choosing each word to avoid revealing classified information while addressing the question honestly. When that service ended, I chose to serve my community in a different way. Cedar Falls became my home, and these people became my family. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was all she was willing to share with cameras rolling and the conversation being broadcast to audiences who wouldn't understand the complexities of military service and the personal costs of operational failures. After the reporters packed up their equipment and departed, Frida found herself alone for the first time since the crisis had begun. She walked to the edge of what had been the high school parking lot, now serving as a boat landing for ongoing rescue and recovery operations, and stared at the transformed landscape of her adopted home. Dr. Sarah Kim approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the temporary relief station that volunteers had established. You look like someone who needs caffeine and maybe some conversation with someone who isn't asking for decisions and directions from you. Thanks for the coffee. I'm not sure about the conversation part, though. Fair enough. But I wanted you to know that what you did last night wasn't just about saving lives, though that would have been enough. You gave this entire community something to hold on to when everything was falling apart around them. Frida accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I just responded to the situation as it developed. Anyone with the right training would have done the same thing. That's what heroes always say, Dr. Kim replied, studying her with the professional curiosity of someone trained to read people accurately. But there's something else, isn't there? Something deeper that brought you to Cedar Falls in the first place. Something that made you want to disappear from whatever life you had before. For a long moment, Frida considered deflecting the question, as she had with the reporters, and countless other inquiries over the past 3 years. But Dr. Kim wasn't a journalist looking for a story or a curious neighbor seeking gossip. She was a medical professional who understood trauma and the long process of healing from experiences that left invisible scars. 3 years ago, I led a mission that went catastrophically wrong, Frida said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain that continued to fall steadily. Intelligence failure, compromised information, bad decisions based on data that turned out to be deliberately falsified. 3 good people died because I trusted the wrong sources and made tactical choices based on information that was designed to get us killed. That's why you left the military and came here? That's why I left everything behind and tried to become someone completely different. I couldn't trust my judgment anymore. Couldn't trust the systems I devoted my life to serving. So I came to Cedar Falls to disappear. To be someone who didn't make life or death decisions that could get people killed. Dr. Kim nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen trauma manifest in many different forms during her medical career. But last night, you made plenty of life or death decisions under extreme pressure. And from what I observed, you got every single one of them right. Last night was different, Frida said, staring out at the flooded landscape that had once been her quiet refuge from the complexities of her former life. I wasn't following orders or relying on intelligence reports that might be compromised. I was looking at real people in immediate danger and responding to situations I could assess with my own eyes and judgment. Maybe that's the lesson you needed to learn through all of this, Dr. Kim suggested gently. That your judgment and decision-making abilities are sound when you're acting on direct information and your own assessment, rather than trusting flawed systems or compromised intelligence. Before Frida could respond to this insight, Rodriguez approached with an update on the ongoing recovery operations that were expanding as more resources became available. Additional volunteers were arriving from neighboring towns. The National Guard was bringing heavy equipment for debris removal and infrastructure repair, and temporary housing trailers were being positioned for families whose homes had been destroyed or severely damaged. Frida, the state emergency coordinator wants to meet with you personally, Rodriguez said. Something about coordinating long-term recovery operations and possibly offering you a position with the State Emergency Management Agency. Tell him he should be talking to Jake Morrison. He's the sheriff and the elected official responsible for this community. He specifically asked for you by name. Says he's reviewed your military service record and wants to discuss opportunities that would use your expertise in emergency management and disaster response. Frida felt the familiar urge to flee, to disappear before her carefully constructed civilian identity could be completely destroyed by unwanted attention and job offers that would drag her back into the world she'd tried so hard to escape. But as she looked around at the people of Cedar Falls working together to rebuild their community, something fundamental had shifted inside her perspective. She wasn't running anymore. Tell the coordinator I'll meet with him, she said, making a decision that surprised even herself. But make it clear that I'm not leaving Cedar Falls. Whatever position or opportunity he's offering, it needs to be based here in this community. The meeting with the state emergency coordinator took place in the high school's conference room, which had been converted into a temporary command center for coordinating recovery efforts. David Chen was a competent bureaucrat in his 50s who'd reviewed Frida's military record and recognized her potential value in disaster response operations throughout Montana. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he began, consulting a file that contained more information about her service record than she was comfortable with civilians possessing. Your actions during the Cedar Falls flood were exceptional by any standard. We could use someone with your experience and proven capabilities to help coordinate disaster response operations across the state. It's just Frida now, she corrected firmly. And I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in state-level positions that would require extensive travel or relocation. What if we structured the position differently? Chen asked, clearly having anticipated her objection. Regional coordinator based permanently in Cedar Falls, responsible for rural disaster preparedness and response coordination. You'd work with small communities throughout this region to develop better emergency plans, coordinate mutual aid agreements, and provide training for local emergency services. The offer was more tempting than Frida wanted to admit. It would allow her to use her specialized skills in meaningful ways while permitting her to stay in the place that had become home. But her experiences with government positions had taught her to be extremely cautious about commitments that sounded too good to be true. I'll consider the possibility, she said carefully. But first, I want to see Cedar Falls through its immediate recovery phase. These people took me in when I needed a home and a fresh start. I owe them my complete attention and commitment until they're back on their feet. Chen nodded approvingly, making notes in his file. That kind of loyalty and commitment to community is exactly why we want you on our team. Take all the time you need to make your decision. The following weeks passed in a blur of organized recovery efforts that transformed Cedar Falls into a model of community resilience. Neighbors helped neighbors clear debris and repair damage. Volunteers arrived from across Montana to assist with cleanup and rebuilding projects. And Frida found herself at the center of coordination efforts that kept the various activities running smoothly and efficiently.
Murphy's Diner reopened in the high school cafeteria, serving meals to volunteers and displaced residents while the original building underwent extensive renovations. Tom Murphy insisted that Frida's job would be waiting for her whenever she wanted to return to normal work. But both of them understood that normal had been permanently redefined by the flood and its aftermath. The temporary food service became much more than a place to eat. It evolved into a community gathering place where people shared stories about the flood, coordinated work projects, and gradually processed the trauma of seeing their hometown transformed overnight. Mrs. Henderson maintained her usual table, her near-death experience having enhanced rather than diminished her role as the town's unofficial social coordinator and morale officer.
"You know, dear," she told Frida one evening as they cleaned up after serving dinner to 60 volunteers, "I've lived in this town for 73 years. I've seen droughts and blizzards, economic booms and busts, young people leaving for the cities, and sometimes coming back with grandchildren. But I've never seen anything bring people together like this flood did. Disasters have a way of showing us what really matters when everything else gets stripped away," Frida replied, stacking chairs with the systematic efficiency that had become her trademark. "They also show us who we really are underneath all the masks we wear," Mrs. Henderson added, with the gentle wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize truth when she saw it. "And who we can become when we stop hiding from ourselves and start embracing our real capabilities."
3 months after the flood, Cedar Falls had achieved something remarkable that attracted attention from emergency management professionals and community development specialists. The town wasn't just rebuilt, it was demonstrably better than it had been before the disaster. New construction incorporated flood-resistant designs and building codes. The emergency response systems had been completely modernized with redundant communication networks, and the community had developed a resilience born of shared hardship and mutual support. Frida had accepted the state coordinator position, establishing her office in the renovated Murphy's Diner building, where she could maintain her connection to the community while serving a broader region. She spent her time traveling to small Montana communities, helping them prepare for emergencies and develop the kind of coordinated response capabilities that had enabled Cedar Falls to survive its crisis with minimal loss of life.
But she always returned home to Cedar Falls, to the community that had given her a second chance at life and the opportunity to use her skills for protection and service, rather than the darker purposes her military career had sometimes required. Jake Morrison, now planning for retirement in the next few years, often joined her for coffee at the rebuilt diner to discuss emergency preparedness plans and community development projects. "You know," he said one morning as they reviewed mutual aid agreements with neighboring counties, "when you first walked into that emergency services building during the flood, I thought we were getting tactical assistance with an immediate crisis." "That's exactly what you got," Frida replied, reviewing training schedules for volunteer emergency responders. "No, that's not all we got," Jake corrected thoughtfully. "We got someone who reminded us that technical expertise without genuine compassion is just mechanical knowledge, but compassion without the skills to act effectively can't save lives when it really matters most." Frida considered this observation as she watched the morning routine of Cedar Falls unfold outside the diner's new windows. Tom Murphy was opening up for the breakfast crowd. Dr. Kim was making her rounds to check on elderly residents. Volunteers were heading out to work on the final reconstruction projects that would complete the town's recovery. "I spent 3 years trying to forget who I was and what I was capable of," she said finally. "It turns out I should have been learning who I could become by integrating my past experiences with my present community." 6 months after the flood, when the last of the major reconstruction projects was completed and life in Cedar Falls had settled into new routines that incorporated lessons learned from the disaster, Frida received an unexpected visitor that would open another chapter in her journey. A young woman in military fatigues appeared at the diner during the quiet afternoon hours, nervous and uncertain, but clearly determined to have a conversation she'd been planning for some time. "Are you Frida Martinez?" the woman asked hesitantly. "I am. What can I do for you?" "Lieutenant Sarah Williams, Army Rangers. I've been following your story through military networks, and I think I need to talk to someone who might understand what I'm going through. Frida looked at the young officer and immediately recognized something familiar. The controlled posture of someone carrying invisible wounds, the careful way she chose words, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of trauma not yet fully processed. She saw herself from 3 years earlier, before Cedar Falls had taught her that healing was possible and that past failures didn't have to define future possibilities. "Would you like some coffee?" Frida asked, gesturing toward a quiet booth in the back of the diner. "And tell me what's going on in your life." As Sarah began her story, a mission that had gone wrong due to intelligence failures, casualties she blamed herself for, a crisis of faith in her abilities, and the military systems she'd devoted her life to serving, Frida realized that her own journey was entering a new phase of purpose and meaning. She'd learned to rebuild her own life after trauma and find meaning in service to her community. Now perhaps she could help other veterans navigate the same difficult transition from military service to civilian life, from the structured certainty of following orders to the more complex challenges of making independent decisions based on personal judgment and community needs. "The mission failed because the intelligence was compromised," Sarah said, her voice tight with the pain of memory. "3 soldiers died because I trusted information that turned out to be deliberately falsified by sources who were working for the enemy. How do I trust my judgment again after something like that?" You learn to distinguish between situations where you have to rely on external information and situations where you can assess conditions directly, Frida replied, drawing on her own hard-won insights. You learn that good judgment isn't about being perfect. It's about making the best decisions possible with the information available, and then taking responsibility for the outcomes without letting failure destroy your ability to act when people need help. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Sarah sharing details about her military service and the psychological aftermath of operational failures, while Frida offered perspective based on her own experience with trauma and recovery. It was the beginning of a mentoring relationship that would become an important part of both their lives. Over the following months, other veterans found their way to Cedar Falls, drawn by stories about the former Navy SEAL who'd found peace and purpose in a small Montana town. Some came seeking advice about transitioning to civilian careers. Others needed help processing combat trauma. And a few were simply looking for a community where their military experience was understood and valued, rather than seen as a liability or source of suspicion. Frida found herself serving as an informal counselor and advocate for veterans throughout the region, helping them access services, find employment, and develop the support networks necessary for successful reintegration into civilian society. The work was challenging, but deeply rewarding, giving her a sense of purpose that went beyond emergency management and disaster response. Cedar Falls embraced this new role for their adopted daughter, with local businesses offering employment preferences for veterans and the community developing programs to support military families during deployment cycles. The town that had once been Frida's refuge from her past became a destination for other veterans seeking their own paths to healing and renewal. Dr. Sarah Kim, observing these developments during her medical practice, noted the positive effects on both the veterans who came seeking help and the community that welcomed them. "You've created something unique here," she told Frida during one of their regular conversations. "A place where military experience is seen as an asset rather than a burden, where people with specialized skills can find meaningful ways to serve their communities." "I didn't create anything," Frida replied. Cedar Falls was already the kind of place that accepts people for who they are and what they can contribute. I just helped make those connections visible. The annual flood memorial service, held on the first anniversary of the disaster, drew visitors from across Montana and neighboring states. Emergency management professionals came to study Cedar Falls' recovery model. Veterans came to learn about successful transition programs, and neighboring communities came to understand how mutual aid and coordinated planning could enhance their own disaster preparedness.
Frida spoke briefly during the ceremony, standing before a memorial wall that honored the community's resilience and the volunteers who'd made recovery possible. Her words were simple, but carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. A year ago, this community faced a crisis that could have destroyed everything we valued about our home and our way of life. Instead, we discovered that our greatest strength wasn't our infrastructure or our emergency plans, though those mattered. Our greatest strength was our willingness to help each other, to use whatever skills and resources we possessed in service of the common good. She paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar over 4 years of shared meals, daily conversations, and mutual support through both ordinary challenges and extraordinary crises. The flood taught us that disasters don't just destroy, they also reveal. They reveal who we really are when everything comfortable and predictable gets swept away. They reveal what we're capable of when we stop hiding our abilities and start using them to protect and serve others. And they reveal that home isn't just a place on a map. It's a community of people who choose to take care of each other, whatever the cost. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Jake Morrison approached Frida with an envelope that bore the seal of the Montana State Emergency Management Agency. "Official recognition," he said with a smile. "The Governor's Award for Excellence in Emergency Response and Community Service. Comes with a cash award and statewide recognition for your contributions to disaster preparedness."
Frida accepted the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Awards and recognition had been important during her military career, markers of professional achievement and acknowledgement from superiors. But the satisfaction she felt now came from different sources: the successful integration of veterans into civilian communities, the enhanced emergency preparedness of rural Montana towns, the simple knowledge that she'd found a way to use her skills in service of life rather than death. "You know what the best part of this whole experience has been?" she asked Jake as they walked toward the rebuilt diner where Tom Murphy was hosting a reception for memorial service attendees. "What's that?" "Learning that heroism isn't about dramatic gestures or extraordinary moments of courage, though those matter when they're needed. Real heroism is about showing up consistently for the people and communities that need you, using whatever abilities you possess to make their lives better and safer." Jake nodded, thinking about his own decades of law enforcement service in a small town where dramatic events were rare, but the daily work of maintaining safety and order required constant attention and dedication. "That's a truth that took me 30 years to understand," he said. "Sounds like you figured it out a little faster." "I had good teachers," Frida replied, gesturing toward the community gathering that filled Murphy's diner with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable companionship of people who'd weathered crisis together and emerged stronger. As the reception continued into the evening, with stories being shared about the flood and the recovery efforts that followed, Frida felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with awards or official recognition. She'd found her way home not by geography, but by purpose. Not by hiding from her past, but by integrating her experiences into service that honored both her capabilities and her community. And
the ghost who'd once tried to disappear into the background of small-town life had become a vital part of Cedar Falls' present and future. Proof that sometimes the most important victories are won not by defeating enemies, but by choosing to build something better from the wreckage of what came before. Outside the diner windows, Cedar Creek flowed peacefully through town, its banks reinforced and its course managed by flood control systems that would protect the community from future disasters. The water that had once threatened to destroy Cedar Falls now served as a reminder of the community's resilience and the power of people working together when effective leadership emerges from unexpected places.
Frida Martinez had found her way home by accepting that heroism wasn't about the uniform you wore, or the rank you held, or the missions you'd completed in distant places. It was about using whatever skills you possessed to protect and serve others, whether that meant carrying a rifle through hostile territory or carrying coffee to neighbors who needed comfort and connection. Both were acts of service. Both required different forms of courage. Both mattered in their own ways. And in the quiet strength of that understanding, Frida had found not just redemption from her past failures, but a purpose that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead in the years to come. The story of Cedar Falls flood would be remembered and retold for generations, serving as an example of community resilience and the unexpected heroes who emerge during times of crisis. But for Frida, it wasn't a story about the past. It was the foundation for whatever came next, built on the solid ground of belonging to a place and people worth protecting with every skill she possessed. She was finally, completely, permanently home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.